chapter 3. Chapter 3 in this small little book of Ruth. We're in verses 6 through 15. We began that section. We called it the providence at work. And this is the second meeting of Boaz and Ruth. The first one took place in chapter 2, verses 3 through 16. And there it was God's providence that he sent Ruth to the field of Boaz, though she did not know where she was going. Well, this time the circumstances are a bit different. This time Naomi sends Ruth to Boaz. So this scene here depicts the response of Ruth and Boaz to Naomi's delicate plan. There is the first section that we mentioned and talked about last week, verses 6 and 7, and then there is the last in verses 14 and 15. And in the first, Ruth puts Naomi's plan into action, and in the second, Boaz responds to Ruth with deeds. And between these two sections there is the main dialogue, and that's where we're at, around verse 7 and 8 in the main dialogue. So Ruth did exactly what Naomi told her to do. And the author now says that these words are commands that Naomi gave to Ruth. Back in verse 5, they were not commands, but here they are. And the description of events given in verse 7 is what Ruth watched. As the text states there, when Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. That's what she saw. She saw these things going on. She saw that. And when she saw it, then she came secretly and uncovered his feet and lay down. So verse 7 is what Ruth watched. And at the end of the day in the fields, a good meal and something to drink is just what's needed. And when his heart was merry, he went to lie down. And then she managed to get over there. After Boaz fell asleep, she crept up beside him and uncovered his legs, it says in verse 7. The text says that she came secretly to uncover his feet and to lie down. The word secretly, there is the same word used in Judges chapter 4 and verse 21 and 1 Samuel chapter 18 and verse 22 as well. And as far as we can tell, Naomi had not mentioned anything about creeping up to Boaz, but of course Ruth had to employ this tactic to be able to uncover his legs so that she wouldn't be noticed beforehand. And the clause that we see here, that she came secretly, it reminds us, if we were to know Hebrew, we would recognize that phrase, she came secretly, is almost identical to another phrase in Judges chapter 4 and verses 16 through 23. There, in that account there's a lady by the name of Jael, Jael, and she drove a tent peg through Sisera's forehead. So that's Judges 4, verses 16 through 23. When she approaches the sleeping general Sisera before killing him, the text says in chapter 4, verse 21 of Judges, she, quote, went secretly to him. And you have almost the exact same phrase here in Ruth chapter 3 and verse 7. Of course, the end of these two scenes here are very different. Sisera dies, Jael approaches him to kill him, and Ruth approaches Boaz for a completely different reason. But in both accounts, you have foreign women approaching a sleeping man after he has had something to drink and he's sleeping. So, of course, her intention, that is Ruth's intention, was not to disturb him. And then it says in verse 8, it happened in the middle of the night that the man was startled and he bent forward, and we mentioned this a little bit. I've tried to add some more notes to this. Ruth has followed instructions to the letter thus far, but she's going to depart from those instructions just a bit. She's not going to change Naomi's desire, and she's not going to change the plan of Naomi, but she's going to change it just a little bit here. We're going to see in a verse or two. So what she's going to do is not wait for Boaz to tell her what to do, but she's going to tell Boaz what to do. We'll see that. So she gives him instructions, but it's difficult to know precisely what she asked him to do, though I think we can come to an understanding of that. How much time elapsed between Boaz falling asleep and Ruth uncovering his feet, and between uncovering his feet and Boaz waking up? It's really difficult to know this. The phrase that we have in your text, in the middle of the night, is literally at the half of the night. Perhaps not as precise as midnight. The Revised Standard Version has midnight, but it's pretty close. So Ruth patiently laid at Boaz's side, at his feet, until finally, sometime during the night, he was startled and he woke up. Lying there at his legs was a woman. He stood up, and how he was able to tell she was a woman, the text doesn't say. Whether it was the form, whether he could see there was no beard, because all men had beard in these days. We don't know exactly how, but he was startled. He lying there at his legs was a woman. And what you have there in verse 8, you'll look at verse 8, a woman was lying at his feet, and verse 9 says, "Who are you?" Well, the word is henna. It's H-I-N-A, henna. And it means look or behold. And it draws the reader, it draws us to jump into Boaz's feet so that we can understand a little bit about what he saw. He sat up and he saw something at his feet, and he didn't know what it was, though he knew it was a woman. He could tell that. And he was afraid. The King James says afraid, woke with a shudder, startled. The New American Standard and the NIV says shivered. And the word startled simply means to frighten. And we talked a little bit about that last week. So shaking or trembling physically is what was going on. He was startled. And in fact, the common reaction to Yahweh's presence, when Yahweh appears or the angel of the Lord appears to people in the Old Testament, you have this kind of reaction. So he was genuinely scared. He had no idea for a second or two what was going on. And that's the common reaction to God's presence. You have trembling, Exodus 19. And the term is further used to describe the effect of Yahweh's coming, of God's coming judgment. And there's several verses down here in the footnotes that we could look at. But something startled Boaz, and he was apparently struck with fear. And we mentioned last night, we don't know, was it the cool of the air and his feet got cold? Did he accidentally turn and kick her and that startled him? Or did she jump or jerk or something and accidentally hit him? We don't know. But he woke up. Whatever the cause, he was frightened. Anyone not expecting company in the dead of night would be struck with fear upon seeing the form or a silhouette at their feet. And you don't know who it is. You don't know what it is. So he was stirred by something. He turned over, and behold, a woman was lying at his feet. Now, we don't know how he knows that, but we do know that the spiritual climate that is the Judges period is not too surprising. The spiritual climate in the period of the Judges may not be the best impression on us, because, the theme of Judges is every man did what was right in his own eyes. Well, it's not that. It's not a prostitute. It's not any kind of thing going on like that. In the day in which the time of the Judges, many would have welcomed a female visitor in the night, but not Boaz. And so he says in verse 9, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your maid. So spread your covering over your maid, for you are a close relative." So Boaz leaves the designation, "my daughter," out. Who are you? Because he doesn't recognize who it is. He's not saying, "Who are you, my daughter?" He used that term for her a few times earlier. But Ruth referred to herself, you might remember in chapter 2, verse 13. She says, "Indeed, you have spoken kindly to your maidservant." Well, Ruth referred to herself and there in chapter 2, verse 13, as a maidservant. And that's a term that means belonging to the lowest rung of the social ladder. So she puts herself way down at the very bottom. And then she says, I'm not worthy to be your maidservant. Well, here the word, when she uses this in verse 9, the word here is amah, which is literally the forearm. But when it's applied to a woman, it's like an extension of your arm, is the implication. I am your maid. I'm your amah. And that term designates the slave when emphasizing her female qualities. I am your amah. In other words, I am a female. I am in need of protection. I am weak. That's what that word communicates. And Boaz understood it perfectly, though we might not. He did. So she refers to herself as a maid, not the widow of Mahlon. That's over. The time of mourning is gone. From the common meaning of amah is derived the frequent use as a self-designation, which suggests a female petitioner's weakness and need for help or protection when presenting a request to a more powerful man. So you have a weaker woman, one who is in need of protection, presenting herself to a man for protection in chapter 3, verse 9 of Ruth. You have the same thing in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 11, when Hannah does it as well. 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 11 and verse 16, Hannah does it. Abigail does it in 1 Samuel chapter 25 and verse 24 and 25. There is the wise woman of Tekoa and Sheba in 2 Samuel chapter 14. There is Bathsheba in 1 Kings chapter 1 and verse 13. And the mother. Remember the mother that brought the child to Solomon and said, decide for us whose child this is? Remember that? And Solomon says, I'll tell you what, just divide it in half and give one half to one woman and the other half to the other woman. And of course, the mom says, no, don't do that. And that's how Solomon knew who the mother really was. Because the other lady would have said, fine, that's good for me. A mom would never say that. And Solomon knew that. So the mother of the son in the Solomonic judgment in 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse 20. So you have all of these cases in the Old Testament where someone's in need of protection presenting themselves to a man, to one who can provide that. It's never presented to another female, always to a male. And feminists just love that. The use of this self-designation indicates the woman's utter dependence on the one she's addressing, or the addressee, and she's asking for favor to grant her request. Now, the term that she used in chapter 2, verse 13, cast her merely in the role of a female worker. But this term here, amah, highlights her gender and therefore the fact that she is marriageable. Yes, she is marriageable, and that comes with the word, and Boaz picks up on that, and he does not hesitate at all. What is Ruth saying? I am looking for security. I am looking for a marriage relationship. Now, when she says in verse 9, she said, I am Ruth your maid, so spread your covering over your maid, for you are a close relative. Naomi didn't tell her to say that. Did she? No. Verse 4, it shall be that when he lies down, that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go and uncover his feet and lie down. Then he will tell you what you should do. Well, she is a bit aggressive, but she doesn't depart from Naomi's plan. Naomi's plan is to provide for her, security for her. She knows that much, and so she is a bit energetic here. The next phrase that you see here, spread your covering over your maid, is crucial to understand what takes place, and precision with this is a little difficult. Naomi is taking responsibility to seek the best for Ruth and knows that Boaz, being a relative, could be the answer. That's chapter 3, verse 1 and 2. He could be. She also expects Boaz to understand the meaning of uncovering the feet and Ruth lying down there. Verse 4. She does not tell Ruth to say anything but to do what Boaz says to do. Ruth agreed to everything Naomi said. Verse 5 and verses 6 and 7 confirm that she followed the instructions exactly. So unless the text gives reason to abandon the goals Naomi is aiming at, when Ruth deviates from some of the details, making her decisions verbally known, she will still be pursuing the same goals that Naomi expressed. Ruth is not going off the rails here. I'm finally out of the house. Mom and Dad can't see me. I want to get married. She's not doing that. That's not what she's doing here. Why would we, the reader, assume that Ruth is changing plans or has a hidden agenda? There's no reason for us to think that. Her very character, what's presented about her, would argue against that. She's not adding to Naomi's instructions either. It's also unlikely she is raising a legal responsibility that Naomi never thought of. Remember, Ruth is simply putting in words what Naomi voiced in her opening statement in verses 1 and 2, chapter 3. Now, she may have carried out Naomi's instructions more aggressively than her mother-in-law intended for her, but her proposal was certainly consistent with the symbolic action of uncovering Boaz's legs. And for that reason, the writer here can say that she carried out Naomi's instructions to the letter, and it not be wrong. Verse 6. So she went down to the threshing floor and did according to all that her mother-in-law had commanded her. That's true. Even though she did add her own signature, so to speak, to the event, it was still Naomi's plan. And her initiative, Ruth's initiative, is surprising, for at this time we would expect to hear from Boaz. We expect for him to set up, startle, and to say something and give direction, and everything is just going to be peachy. But though we expect to hear from him, that's not what happens. First of all, she turns the attention away from herself and onto Boaz. It's extraordinary because she has just described herself as a servant, and he is the master. She is a foreigner. He is a native. She's a female. He's a male. She is an uninvited visitor. We would not expect to hear from her, but we do hear from her there in verse 9. Second of all, her statement adds nothing to the question Boaz asked, "Who are you?" It only raises the question, who is Boaz? Who is Boaz? Third, out of the blue, Ruth requests that Boaz marry her. And the idiom, the saying, the expression may be puzzling to people today, but there was no question about the meaning on Boaz's part. The words "spread your covering over" literally means to spread one's wings over. Well, it's not hard to get that depiction. When you spread your wings over something, you're protecting, providing shelter, comforting. All of those, some of those maybe more particularly, and all the above. So this gesture of a man covering a woman with his garment was a symbolic act, which, according to Near Eastern custom, signified the establishment of a new relationship and the symbolic declaration of the husband to provide for the sustenance of the future wife. So when he does that, and there are things in our own society that you would think that you would associate the same way. When you spread your covering over, then it has this symbolic meaning and it communicates something, right? When you see a girl and a boy holding hands, what does it communicate? Obviously, yes, the same thing, right? They like each other, there's intentions there. So it's not, we have the same kind of things in our society that that happened that way? Well, spreading your wings over has this implication. It communicates this. Now, the text does not say if Boaz did cover Ruth. She asked him to, spread your covering over your maid. It does not refer to sexual intercourse per se. Boaz does not interpret this as an invitation for sex, but as a proposition for marriage. And that conclusion is supported by verses 10 through 13. We'll see that when we get to verses 10 through 13. That's supported there. Assuming, on the basis of the rest of the story, that the actions of the characters are not only not contrary to the law, but that their actions are virtuous beyond the demands of the law, there's no reason to believe immoral behavior has occurred here. It would be completely inconsistent with the book itself and everything that it says in the book. Very inconsistent. This is what Naomi had in mind as security for Ruth. So Ruth calls on Boaz to be the answer to his own invocation of blessing on her in chapter 2, verse 12. Chapter 2, verse 12, may the Lord reward your work and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. So what Ruth does now is invite him to be the answer to his prayer, to that prayer that he prayed. An invitation that he will not refuse. The marriage, we don't know if it happens, but the marriage was to be the means by which God protected Ruth and repay her in full for her past kindness. Of course, we don't know that yet. You're not supposed to know that yet. In Deuteronomy chapter 22 and chapter 27 and Ezekiel chapter 16 and verse 8, you have the removal or the spreading of the skirt of a man's robe over a woman. It's used as a euphemism for marriage. So it's not the only time in Scripture where you would see this. Deuteronomy 22, verse 30 and 27, verse 20. Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 8, God said, did I not spread my skirt over you and cover you with my skirt? It's an indication of relationship, marriage. Am I not a good father to you? Why have you been an unfaithful wife to me? God would say to Israel. The passages in Deuteronomy are instructions in the law of behavior and clearly imply sexual intercourse. But as noted above, the character of Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz rule out such activity. Ezekiel 16, verse 8 does say, so I spread my skirt over you and covered your nakedness. It says further, I also swore to you and entered into a covenant with you so that you became mine. That's God speaking about Israel, so clearly it doesn't mean to have sexual relations at all. But the message is communicated, you're mine, you have a relationship with me. And that's 1, 2, 3. This is number 4. Fourth, the ground that Ruth gives for her statement is also extraordinary. Ruth seems knowledgeable of Israelites' customs, and it is not difficult to think that Ruth and Naomi had discussed this subject. Naomi had identified Boaz as being a relative of some kind. Back in verse 2 of chapter 3, Boaz, our kinsman. The term there is not goel, but it means close relationship, family relationship. So there is a relationship there, though we don't know the closeness of it or the distance of it at this point. But Ruth classifies him here as one who qualified to fulfill the role. Look what she says in verse 9. Who are you? She said, I am Ruth, your maid, so spread your covering over your maid, for you are a goel. Now the term goel is used. Naomi says back in verse 2, he is a close relative. Ruth says you are a goel. You have the ability to meet the demands here, to supply what's needed, is what she's saying to him. So she appealed to Boaz, his status as a benefactor, as a goel. It is as if Ruth is gently lecturing Boaz on his obligations to her. The servant is demanding that the boss marry her, a Moabite making the demand of an Israelite, a woman making the demand of a man, a poor woman making a demand of a rich man. From a purely human perspective, the plan was doomed from the beginning as a hopeless gamble, and the responsibility Naomi put on Ruth was unreasonable. You think about all this. But it worked. It worked. She pulled it off. God was blessing her. God was guiding everything that she did. Was Ruth doing this to benefit Naomi by providing her with an heir? She did not identify herself to Boaz by her family connection. She did not say, I am Ruth, the widow of Mahlon. She says, I am Ruth, your maid. Her response is simply, I am Ruth, your maid, stressing her status as eligible for marriage to a man of Boaz's position, not as the widow who must raise an heir to her husband's estate. And furthermore, the phrase, spread your covering over your maid, relates specifically and narrowly to marriage. So, does Ruth do this to benefit Naomi? The answer is no. Evidently, neither one of them are thinking about an heir at this point. She's a widowed woman who has no protection in this society, who has nothing, and she needs protection, and she needs these things. And so here is a man in the family relationship who might offer that. She says these things to her, which is really out there for this day and time for her to say. Verse 10, then he said, may you be blessed of the Lord, my daughter. You have shown your last kindness to be better than the first by not going after young men, whether poor or rich. So Boaz's response is as astonishing as her deeds and words were. He is so caught up in the pleasure of being her choice that he pronounces a blessing on her. Why does he react this way? How is it that being awakened in the middle of the night in a most unusual and compromising situation, he knows exactly what Ruth meant by her veiled speech, and he commends her for it? These are hardly the words of a man who has been seduced by a woman of the night. Again, the hidden hand of God becomes visible in their reactions and their dispositions to one another. In the end, God's agenda is fulfilled. So the blessing breaks the tension in the scene. Who are you? I am Ruth. I am your servant. I'm your maid. Spread your covering over me, for you are a goel. And I don't know how long he paused before he said, verse 10, may you be blessed of the Lord. I'm sure there was a couple of seconds because he had to think about what she just said. That was big time stuff. She just asked me to be her husband. Wow. Pause. Do I really want to do this? Pause. May you be blessed. Yes, I do want to do this. So the blessing breaks the tension in the scene, and we, the readers, can breathe now. It's over. It's identical to the blessing Naomi pronounced on Boaz. This is identical to the blessing that Naomi pronounced on Boaz back in chapter 2, verse 20. Chapter 2, verse 20, the text says, may he be blessed of the Lord who has not withheld his kindness to the living and to the dead. Well, he repeats that blessing to Ruth. Boaz repeats that blessing to Ruth at this point. So what is your last act of kindness that he refers to here? Well, the context seems to give the answer. By not going after young men, whether poor or rich. So this last act of kindness is in some sense her proposal of marriage. She has really gone out on a limb, a daring appearance on the threshing floor to ask Boaz to marry her. This act is compared to her first act. What is that? That is that she totally, what is her first act? That's left totally to the implications of the context. Commentators that I read, I got 4 listed here, agree that the first act is Ruth's total commitment to Naomi and her people over her own. Your last act to come to me is even greater than your first. You left your own people to go to a land that you had no roots in. You knew no one. You had no means of surviving in this land. You're completely dependent on the kindness of people, the kindness of God. Boaz knows this, and he eulogizes her for it. Back in chapter 2 and verse 11, Boaz replied to her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me, how you left your father and your mother and the land of your birth and came to a people that you did not previously know." That was quite an act, quite a deed. But Boaz says, now this last one is greater than the first one. Now, he's not building himself up. He's not saying, "Girl, you made a great choice. I'm a wonderful man." He's not saying that. He's not saying that at all. Don't think that. We'll get to that here in just a moment. But greater than her first act is Naomi leaving her own people Ruth leaving her own people for Israel. Boaz again knows that, and he eulogizes her for it. Chapter 2, verse 11. It does seem odd or inappropriate that Boaz designates Ruth's request for marriage to him rather than to a younger man as a better act than loyalty to Naomi. How can one not find fault with the man who chooses to value a marriage proposal over an act of mercy? And the question presupposes an answer like, quote, "She is requesting Boaz to fulfill the duty of a levirate marriage in order to provide an heir for the line of Elimelech and Mahlon." But we've argued above here, or before this, that Ruth is not using the term redeemer in a technical legal sense. The verse plainly says, "by not going after young men, whether poor or rich." She's a quote-unquote free agent when it comes to marriage. She could have gone after any of the men and was under no obligation to become the wife of Mahlon's closest relative to raise an heir. Nor is there any hint from Naomi or Ruth that they are acting upon this responsibility. Another question emerges. Even though Ruth meant no more than a request for marriage, does Boaz hear more than that? Does he hear more than that? Is he reading something into that? Well, according to what follows in verses 11 through 13, he does indeed. The last phrase of verse 10, "by not going after young men, whether rich or poor," is explanatory. The English expression "in doing something" conveys the idea. Ruth has shown her last act of kindness to be better than her first in doing something, namely, not going after young men, whether rich or poor. Ruth is commended for not going after young men, that is, the fully grown, vigorous, unmarried men. She did not pursue for the purpose of marriage this class of individuals, these with significant means to marry or fulfill the requirement of redemption. She didn't go after these. Remember, this is not a Western society. The range of possible activities, in other words, what freedom is afforded a woman to pursue a husband, is far more subtle and far more limited. whether poor or rich, functions as a merism, that is, for anyone else at all. This is what she did. Now, Boaz is not a withered old man. He is still able to work a full day in the fields and then stay at the threshing floor all night. Nor is he a poor man. Chapter 2, verse 1 tells us he's not poor. He recognizes, however, that if Ruth would have married for status, maybe a young man, or she would have married for love, whether he was rich or poor, perhaps he was poor, married for love, or money, she could have gone elsewhere. He recognizes that. She could have gone elsewhere. Boaz himself may qualify on these accounts, but he intentionally deflects the attention from himself to Ruth and commends her for what she has done. Verse 11. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you whatever you ask, for all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence. So the opening now, I think the text literally says, and now. It shifts in focus from the interpretation of Ruth's actions to the consequences of those actions for the future. So with the characteristic tenderness, Boaz addresses her as my daughter. You see that term of endearment come back into his phrase, my daughter. Be assured, or set your mind at rest, is what he's saying. Do not fear. Be assured. Be at rest. Boaz then responds with a remarkable statement. He says, I will do for you whatever you ask. Now, I know some guys that would say, don't ever say that to a woman. You'll be working 3 jobs for the rest of your life buying things for her. And you quickly dismiss that kind of stuff. But he says this, I will do whatever you ask, promising to comply with her request. Yes, I'll marry you. But there's one relative that's closer than me, and I need to work this out. Go home, don't fear, I'm going to work this out, and I'll let you know what happens. Boaz's statement is identical to Ruth's earlier assent to Naomi's instructions. Verse 5 of chapter, all that you say I will do. Boaz says to Ruth, all that you say, whatever you ask, I will give you. I will do for you. But there's a crucial addition here that Boaz adds. Not only will he do everything she asked, but also he will do it for her. Ruth is the subject of his commitment. Not Naomi, not Elimelech, not Mahlon. It is Ruth. The single request that Ruth made in verse 9 was recognized by Boaz to be a little bit more complicated. We're going to see that in verses 12 and 13 next week. His rationale is, for all my people in the city, or in the city gate, know. It's a phrase signifying assembly or the community, the legally responsible body of people who live in town. All of them, they know your character. So whatever the exact nuance, the sense is clear here. It was a matter of common knowledge. By his own words, he agrees to the request because of her high reputation, which was commonly known. And then he calls her a woman of excellence, a woman of strength of character. The phrase stresses the quality of Ruth's character. This word here occurs only in Proverbs chapter 12, verse 4, and chapter 31, verse 10. It's a phrase that's reserved for the ideal wife. In Proverbs 31:10, it says, her strength is an admirable character trait. Verse 11, and those traits would be, verse 11, trustworthiness. Verses 13 through 15, her industry. She works, she labors, she She puts things together. She causes the home to function smoothly. Shrewdness in verses 16 and 18. Generosity toward the needy in verse 20. All of those things garner that term strength, a woman of excellence. Bethlehem, no doubt, saw in Ruth the same self-sacrifice and industry that they would later know about and read about in Proverbs. And this is the description given to Boaz in chapter 2, verse 1. Back in chapter 2, verse 1, a man of great wealth of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz, a man of great strength. You can see in your margin, you may have a note in your margin, a mighty, a valiant man. So an amazing turn of events has occurred. Ruth had arrived in Bethlehem a couple of months, maybe 3 months earlier or so, as a destitute widow and a foreigner at the mercy of the locals there. In chapter 2, with no recourse but to glean in fields behind servants, she exhibits qualities that quickly arrest the attention of Boaz. She gains her reputation not by trying to be somebody or associating with the important people. She's not playing politics, in other words. Rather, it was her self-effacing personification, her self-effacing embodiment of Israel's covenant standards. Here was a Moabite woman who actually displayed the character of Israel's God. Faithfulness, staying with something and not abandoning it. Self-sacrifice for the sake of a mother-in-law, for example. That's character kind of things. That's the character of God. Her loving kindness and loyalty to the family of her dead husband, especially to her mother-in-law, won her the prize of Boaz and the people. Character matters. It does. And that's all I have. Any questions? Obviously, next week, now it is true I am a close relative. So he's going to start to explain to her, you're right about this, but there is one who is closer, and I need to work things out. And so verse 14, there's the rest of the night. She lay at his feet until morning, and then she rose before anyone could recognize another. So Boaz recognizes that this was a little bit of a compromising situation, and your character may take a hit if you're seen, and so there was the plan to avoid that. So that there was no cause for her character to take a hit, but people will not generally think the best all the time. Any questions about anything? I hope this is a blessing in many ways to you. It's fun to study, I'll tell you. It's really fun to study. No? Okay, well, next week we'll pick it up with verse 12 and hopefully finish the rest of the chapter. And then I'm thinking, after we finish Ruth, I'm thinking that we'll do a series on suffering. I'm reading some books, and I'm enjoying these books, and when I do that, it prompts all kinds of ideas and stuff, so maybe do a series on suffering. Looking at Old Testament, New Testament, what the passages say about those things. So we'll see. Father, thank you for your blessings. Tonight we have worshiped you